So, kind of the first question is, when you look at Alberta, it has those dynasties. You have the Liberals, the UFA, Social Credit, Progressive Conservatives, and then you get this kind of strange thing that happens with the NDP. And then the NDP, if you look at history, we should be expecting the NDP to rule Alberta for 20 years, but that
Yeah,
didn't happen. So, what were some of the factors that kind of led to this shift in how Alberta essentially does politics?
sure. Well, I think part of it is the province isn't the same. I mean, it changed a lot, and I think despite the progressive conservatives hanging around for 44 years, I think there were some things going on underneath that which really shifted the province. And really, I mean, you can already see signs of it in the 2012 election, which was the Progressive Conservatives under Alison Redford and the Wildrose under Danielle Smith. And similarly, you saw, I mean, it was expected through much of the campaign that it would go to Wildrose, and at the end, it was the PCs. What you saw then, I think, were a fair number of people in the center and maybe even a little bit into the center left, um, really voting strategically with the PCs to keep the Wildrose out at that point. So yeah, I think some of the signs were already there, but it just I think took that moment of the 2015 campaign to break the spell. I think there were a few missteps on the part of the late Jim Prentice. I think calling the election early seemed opportunistic. Um, I think there was some anger over the merger with Wildrose, well, partial anyway, and also I think some of his statements, true as some of them might have been, did not land well with the electorate. So I think there were already a lot of the elements in place. It was just masked by the inertia of that PC kind of I guess it's hard to come up with a word, but sort of coalition of voters.
And then we get to the 2019 election, which I remember very well. I remember the carbon tax was kind of the big thing, and Jason Kenney was saying, if I'm elected, I'll get rid of the carbon tax, kind of leaving out the fact that then the federal carbon tax comes into place. But it's politics. I get why they do that. So what happens to suddenly we go this one way to the NDP, and then we shift right back to essentially a conservative government, progressive conservative, UCP, whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, I think again, Kenny's project, which was really creating a united party on the right, was a lot of that, and I think he was able to parlay a pretty high profile at a federal level. And remember, all through this, Albertans are voting conservative federally, no matter what. With a few exceptions, a couple of ridings in Edmonton, one in Calgary, but really they are. He's able to translate that. People expected a lot of him when he came here. He had a very high profile within the Harper government, and he was seen as a real power broker in that party in the wake of Harper's departure. So I think Albertans, it was him coming back, and I think they really, again, bought into the notion that he could come in from Ottawa, experienced politician, capable, and fix all their problems. So I think that was part of it. Also, again, at this point, oil has been languishing in price for going on 5 years, and it's really I think people were kind of hoping for change on that level, and they don't always pursue the change in ways that really make causal sense, but that's what they went for.
And kind of this is related to the elections as a whole rather than just 2015 or 2019. Why does Alberta, we've only ever had majority governments. We always go one way or the other. And I mean, this election in 2023 could change that. We could see a minority government based on some polls. Why do we always seem to go big in for one party?
Yeah, it's true. And the old saying, Albertans don't vote, they stampede, kind of plays in here. It's more of a Calgary thing, I guess. But Um, yeah, it's hard to say. I think even here we have a two-party system. Essentially, that's what
Hmm.
it's come down to the last couple of elections. And I think in previously there just so much of the so much of the weight of the province just electorally was one side or the other. I think it was 2015, a lot of angry voters, and they, on the right, they did split the vote to some extent in some ridings that would have otherwise won. Um, it's hard to say. And this time out, even though, yeah, it could be a minority government, but on the other hand, the vote has really coalesced around these two parties on both sides. I don't think it doesn't look like the Alberta Party or the Liberals are going to be taking many votes away from the NDP. And on the other side, um, the Wild Rose Independence Party and all the rest have not. They seem to be. Daniel Smith seems to have got some of those votes back into the UCP fold. So we shall see. But I'm thinking, given that it's two parties, we'll probably end up with majority. Now, it might not be a huge majority
Hmm.
either way. In fact, that doesn't seem very likely, depending on what Calgarians do. But it is interesting. It's a very different political landscape this time, and it really, this two-party thing has been emerging over these past couple of elections, and I think it's here to stay for a while anyway.
Absolutely. No, so with Jason Kenney, he comes to power, he gets rid of the carbon tax. Oil seems to be doing relatively okay, and then obviously COVID happens. Do you feel like Jason Kenney would still be in power with, and it might be obvious, but
Yeah,
without COVID?
it's possible. I think it exposed some deep fractures within the UCP, but those fractures were already there, and in fact, his popularity was already dropped considerably in the fall of 2019.
Mhm.
It was really essentially as soon as they started actually doing things. That first budget was not a popular budget. It was, slash and burn. Certainly, we felt it in post secondary. And in many other places. And his popularity was already plummeting at that point. And by the time COVID for every other politician, if premier in Canada and the prime minister, there was actually an uptick in popularity in the first few months of COVID. That didn't happen to Kenney.
Mhm.
Uh, Alone of all of the leaders. So it's interesting to speculate. Maybe he would have been able to paper over those cracks more effectively between the more right-leaning, libertarian part of the party and more of the center. But those fractures were already there, and it's unclear whether ultimately he could have hung on. His style, he's certainly, he's all elbows political style, and I think some people on whatever side of the spectrum you're on, um, didn't always win him friends, and he needed them in that party.
Mhm.
So they're really hard to govern that party. I mean, it's the reason why you'd seen an exodus to the right out of the PCs over the years to Wild Rose. It became a harder and harder coalition to maintain.
Mhm. Whether you like Kenny or not, can you see him in some ways as a tragic figure? Because he
Mhm.
joins the Reform Party in the 90s. He rises through the party, becomes the Conservatives. He's a cabinet minister. Like you said, he's very high profile. He wins the election, swings Alberta back to Conservatives. And it seemed like during COVID, both sides were mad at him. He did too much or he did
Yep.
too little. Like there was nothing he could do right.
No, that's true. It did tend to vacillate from one side to the other. But you're right. I mean, tragic does come up, and in fact, in at least one of the chapters, the theme is hubris, right? Fits in well with that tragic profile. But sometimes, yeah, Kenny could be his own worst enemy. And I think, yeah, he was kind of caught in the middle between these two factions, not only of Albertans, but really within his own party. Um, and the problem is that sometimes he would change direction, and having really rhetorically committed very strongly to one course of action. I mean, he would go in guns blazing and dismissive of any alternatives. And then 2 weeks later, he's changing his mind. And it's, well, why did you make this so difficult for yourself if you hadn't,
Mhm.
you wouldn't have to climb down if you hadn't been quite so categorical in the first place. But yeah, sure. I mean, it's really, it's a strange end to a really, very successful political career up until that point. Um, that really, and yeah, realistically, maybe he would be, he would be doing much better in the polls today had he hung around. But at the time he left, it was not, wasn't looking good. A year out from an election, and half of your party doesn't really want you around. It's not a strong position. So yeah, timing, it
Mhm.
certainly matters in politics.
In regards to that, so he hangs on, I think, with like 51% of the vote, right around there. So technically, he could have stayed in power and said, "No,
Yeah.
I'm going to march us into the next election." Would the would there be a chance of the party winning with Jason Kenney going into 2023 versus having Danielle Smith in power?
It's possible. It's hard to say. I mean, Kenney at a certain point had become very politically unpopular. I think the risk for Kenney, if he had continued in the party, is maybe he would have had more support um, from the center. But I think some of the parts of the UCP would have walked and formed their own party, which would have complicated things, especially in maybe some of the rural ridings and also some of the smaller cities in Alberta, where uh, their position isn't so strong that they can't afford not to have a united vote on the right. So it is really hard to say what precisely would have played out, but I don't think he would have been necessarily in a much weaker position. Um, and who knows? I mean, and they may still win under Smith. I mean, the election is pretty close in many respects. Um, but yeah, it's been a complicated party to govern. I think Kenney invoked some of the anger, um, and then couldn't quite ride the tiger. It's tough. It's a tough thing to do, um, to maintain people being angry at the establishment when you are the establishment, and not have it directed at you. And that's pretty much what happened to him.
Being any type of leader, obviously you need charisma, you need to be able to inspire people. And when you look federally with conservative leaders like, say, Diefenbaker and Mulrooney, they were able to hold the party together, at least for a
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
And they had that charisma, they were dynamic people. And when I think of Kenny, the one thing I think about is when he was trying to fill up a truck with gas and he couldn't get the nozzle out,
yeah,
and like just
yeah,
the image of that. And I felt bad for the guy. Like he looked like he just felt really
yeah,
stupid there.
yeah,
If he had more of that charisma, more, not the elbow
yeah.
political style, would have that helped him more?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think part of the decision to leave federal politics, and I think not to take on Justin Trudeau is, again, he just isn't going to be as he doesn't have that easy style of relating to voters that much. The whole blue truck thing. I mean, yeah, that and we do actually have a chapter on the whole symbology of that, as you know. And yeah, it did seem peculiarly apt at the point where his political career is failing, that suddenly you have this photo up and he can't actually, yeah, gas up his truck properly. It was an unfortunate moment. It seemed, peculiarly apt. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and he must have been wondering if someone up there hates him. But it was but it was really indicative of, some of the hollowness of that image. I mean, I don't know that Kenny had been much of a truck driver prior to moving back to Alberta,
Yeah.
and uh, and certainly it seemed like he hardly drove the thing anyway, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that kind of showed it up. But it's a lot of these persona that you craft. I mean, it's yeah, you can see some people find it much easier than others, and sometimes it's not always a huge detriment. I don't think Stephen Harper gave off a lot of warm and fuzzy vibes, but he managed to, um, govern for, the better part of 10 years and hold together um, the conservatives at a federal level. But Kenney, yeah, he's not, yeah, he can be a little bit aggressive, and I don't think people always necessarily warm to him all that much. So it's just an asset that, politically he doesn't have.
Mhm.
And again, it's not like it's absolutely fatal, but I think he took on a lot of fights that he didn't need to, and I think that's another thing going on as well.
In regards to the hollowness of the image, I mean, I'm born and raised in Alberta, and obviously you see pickup trucks everywhere. And the pickup truck was part of it. I mean, he drove out on stage in
Yep.
a pickup truck on election night.
Yeah.
If he had been more true to who he was, like he was, like you said, he came from the east out west, and
Yeah.
if he had been more true to who he was, more authentic, would have maybe that won him more support from both sides, who saw him as,
Yeah.
this is who I am. I'm not trying to pretend to be,
Yeah.
Trucker Kenny.
Yeah. Possibly. It might have been if he'd been seen as more authentically who he was. But let's remember, I mean, initially he actually did have some success. I mean, he did
Mhm.
manage to, win the PC leadership, unite the parties, putting himself, and getting to be leader. And that first election did tremendously well. But yeah, maybe at a certain point, people start taking a closer look and thinking, this is not um, it seemed sometimes more like a caricature. And as Chase and Tyler's chapter suggests, the choice of a blue Dodge Ram is very it's not accidental. It's not just like, oh, you could go for a Toyota Tundra or something like that. No, it had to be that truck. And in a certain sense, yeah, it's all kind of contrived. And sure, that happens in politics, but at a certain point, that looks more contrived than most things. And yeah, it's hard to square up Kenney with that image precisely. But again, initially it played fairly well. I think people were feeling a little bit desperate with, again, a long-term slump in oil prices, and we're kind of looking for somebody to lead them out of the wilderness.
Mhm. Now, in regards to the book, what kind of inspired you to kind of do this? Obviously, with Duane and David to put this book together.
Well, I mean, it's a sequel. So the earlier Orange Chinook was meant as a way of marking this pretty seismic shift in Alberta politics. I mean, I was a little kid when the PCs came into power. Um, and it just I think, and initially I think David was really the motive motive force for this, of really feeling we needed to talk about this, to mark this change, to um, you know look at what had finally ended the one of the longest running dynasties, if not the longest running, in Canadian politics. So there was that thought to really mark that, and also noting that there aren't that many books about election campaigns at the provincial level.
Mhm.
And I don't think there'd been any about Alberta. So again, it was another um, way of being able to talk about Alberta politics. It had suddenly become less predictable. And so we really felt we had to do the follow-up and to talk about, okay, what had happened um, in the what had happened in 2019, and the formation of this new party. It's also worth noting, that it was in many ways a brand new party. The PCs are gone, like they don't exist anymore. Um, and in that sense, they follow the script for Alberta parties. Once you lose an election, you're supposed to be done. You'll never be back in power, and that is pretty definitely the case with the PCs. But it was really meant to look at what was suddenly a much more turbulent political environment than it had been in a long, long time.
Yeah, As a side note, I'm on my podcast, I'm talking about every election in Alberta's history in the lead up to the election.
Yeah,
And you definitely see that. I mean, the Liberals, never again. The UFA is completely wiped out in the 1935 election, it's just gone.
yeah,
Social Credit loses to Peter Lougheed in 71. And then by 90 or 1982, I think they're done.
yeah,
And it's the same progressive conservatives. It's like, it's very funny. Alberta will go, yeah, we support you for decades. And then once they're done, you are gone.
yeah.
Like there's no coming back from it.
That's right. No, you don't come back. We're done with you.
Yeah.
And looking ahead to the next party. Now, it's interesting to see the NDP who have a realistic shot at winning again, coming back in power. That would be really weird and kind of unprecedented in Alberta politics. But it really is a different province. I mean, it's not only, I think, there's always been a fair amount of the province which is not conservative. I think having a party finally the vote coalescing around the NDP was kind of novel. It always kind of been split between them and the Liberals, and I think just a lot of influx of people who aren't necessarily who don't necessarily view the rest of Canada as the enemy, and I think that changes the dynamic a little bit in terms of what voters are expecting. I mean, the sharpest divide really seems, and this is not just the case for Alberta, it's almost everywhere, is an urban rural split. We just, they're different worlds in a lot of ways. And even the rural, we has some interesting divisions in it. Again, Roger Epps' chapter would speak to that to some extent. But that's the case in all sorts of places. So in Alberta, what we're looking at, is a really Edmonton, it's pretty clear it's going NDP. I mean, rural ridings for the most part look UCP. It's Calgary where we're not sure what's going to happen. Some of the ridings look like they will definitely go NDP. It's just how many of them. I mean, certainly my local MLA has been trying, who is UCP, has been trying to do his best to pretend he has nothing to do with the party. You don't see the mention and signs on the neighborhood, no mention of the UCP, not even the party colors. So I don't know. I think there's and I've heard rumors that Rick McIver is out door knocking already, which is something he's not really done before in his writing. So everybody knows it's up for grabs. But it's really it's interesting. There's really a sharp divide between a lot of what rural Albertans seem to want and the priorities of the big cities.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting election. That kind of leads into the last question: is what do you think will happen in this election? I know it's hard to predict. I mean,
yeah.
In your opinion, could we see UCP have a second win? Could it be minority?
Yeah.
Could the NDP roar back? I mean, it's all up in the air, really.
Yeah, it could go either way. I think it's really close. It's a really close election in a lot of respects. I'm doubtful about a minority just because I'm not sure you would need a third party to really peel away enough votes from one of the two main ones to create that. I mean, I suppose it's conceivable, but I think it will be close, whatever happens. All indications are it's going to come down to Calgary and whatever happens here. I expect the campaign will look like a lot of promises being made to Calgary. Both sides will be offering all sorts of things. I mean, we saw that already in the budget. There's a lot of spending on a lot of different stuff. So it will be interesting, but I think it will end with minority, maybe not a very strong one though on either side. I'm not sure either has the ability to really carve out a huge majority at this point, but it really does, I believe, come down to those two parties.
Without a doubt. I did notice that I think it's a Saddle Dome is suddenly they're talking about a new arena when they were kind of saying, no, we're not going to do that. And now it's like, okay, well, maybe we can, help you with that.
No, and it's been interesting to watch that because I've been keeping my eye on that situation for a while. It may not be the vote winner they think, because there's a lot of people in the city. I mean, we voted not to spend public money on another Olympic bid just a couple of years ago. And the support for spending public money on an arena for the Flames is not huge here. There are a lot of people, that's a non-starter. Given, you know, billionaire owners paying millionaires, and you're a profit-seeking enterprise, actually quite profitable enterprise. You know what? And again, there is no economic case for spending public money on these things. There just isn't one. It does not. You opening a new grocery store would bring in as much. It make as much of a difference to the local economy. And one of the weird revivals is looking at the West Village site again, and just the remediation involved in that site, given it's just filled with creosote. Would have to be, it would be a fairly major undertaking. So having that revived, again, it's just weird to see. But as you know, it's election season, so you know, it's just,
and yeah, everything's on the table.
Exactly. We'll you know, promise you all sorts of stuff. And I think people have to look closely at, you know, what things look like after an election. That either party, you know, with a mandate, they'll always take it to mean more than it does. So you know, you got to be thinking about what it means to actually have one of these parties in power, either side, for the next 4 years. And the political business cycle suggests that the first couple of years are going to be is when things are going to be a little less rosy, and less, well, fewer good news budgets, put it that way. So